what we did is we hid my mother, my sister, and my little youngest brother in the attic of the place where we were now in the ghetto, because we were afraid to take them out. Whereas originally, during the initial massacres of people in Dinov, the healthy between the ages of 16 and 60 were being killed. Women, children, and the elderly were left alone. Now it was exactly the opposite. The healthy could be put to slave labor, but women, children, and the elderly were useless. So they were to be the first victims to go. So we hid my mother, my sister, and my little brother. My cousins hid their parents in a double wall in the house. A relative of ours, my aunt's brother, Moshe Heller, hid his wife and two little babies. And we went out to the Targovitsa. There, the place was already ringed with Ukrainian volunteer SS with machine guns aimed at us. There were already Poles assembling around the periphery to observe this ordeal. There was Gestapo there from our town, but there was Gestapo also from a neighboring town, including some that I did not know. I happen to know all the Gestapo men because they used to come in to our shop. So I knew them by name. But there was one Gestapo man whom I did not know, and he seemed to be running the entire show. He walked around with his whip, had us all lined up in rows of 5, then ordered all the people in the wheelchairs, those brought in in the wheelbarrows, and ordered them placed in a separate corner of the place. It was immediately evident that these people are probably going to be doomed. No one would have thought that they're going to go to a hospital, of course. They took him there, and there was chaos, screaming and crying as children wanted to go with their grandparents. Daughters wanted to go with their mothers, who were placed into that corner. And the assessman with his whip was whipping them back to get in line again. The purpose of which I couldn't understand, because it eventually turned out they were all killed. But anyway, this is what went on. Then an officer from the airbase came, Oberzahlmeister Frankfurter. I came to know him afterwards when I worked and had been assigned to the work at the airbase. He came and he picked out the Jews that worked for him at the airbase, and he was allowed to take him back to work. There came a foreman from the refinery. He took the Jews that worked there away with him. There came a foreman from the Kirchhoff company that was building roads, a road building company, and they took theirs with them. And then one of the Gestapo men from our town called out names. And he called out our name, and a number of tradespeople in our town who used to work for them and were considered essential to the economy of the town as well as to the German war economy. He called us out, there was a table there, and he gave us a blue card. The blue card was a permit for you to stay in town, go back to the ghetto. And approximately a few hundred of us received the blue card. The rest of the people there, including my uncle Abraham and his kids, and all the other people, were kept there. They had to sit down. It was a hot day, and we were sent back to the ghetto. Before we were sent back to the ghetto, a few trucks arrived, and they were lined up to where the people, the doomed people, were in the corner there. Soon 2 jeeps with mounted machine guns came, and soon a truck with SA men, the ones who were in the olive uniforms and the swastika armbands, came, holding shovels, came along, and it was immediately evident that these people are going to be killed with those machine guns, and the SA men with the shovels are going to bury them. And indeed, as they forced them all on the trucks, a SS man with a machine gun on top of the roof of the truck, and they were ordered to rid them off in a certain direction. The jeeps with the machine guns had been ordered to rid them off into the same direction before the trucks, as well as the guys with the shovels. We found out the following day that they were taken to a village not far from our hometown in a forested area, and they were all shot. And so they were all the victims from the Targovica. Amongst them, I remember clearly, was Mr. Reeder, who was a hat maker. He was a religious Jew, and he went with his tallis under his arms there. And about a day or 2 days later, I found out from a Polish lady whom we knew very well, who was serving a German SA man, that he had come back that day drunk, totally drunk, and was describing to her how Mr. Reeder, who lived in the same house before, wrapped himself around in the prayer shawl as he was chased into the mass grave and shot. And this was all great fun to him, to this SA man. So we knew that they were all gone. We didn't know exactly what happened to the people that were left sitting there on the Targovica. But we found out within a few days that they were sitting there supposedly a long time in the heat, without water, without food. They had to leave everything they had with them there and were driven off to the railroad station, loaded into wagons, 60 to 100 to a wagon, including the head of the Jewish community elders, Mr. Engel, and they were driven off to the extermination camp of Belzec, whence no one ever returned. Within a few days, some Poles came and wanted, claiming that they have letters from my uncle Abraham, and if my father would give them money, they would give him the letter. We had already heard that they most likely were all killed. So we knew this is extortion. We didn't give him any money. But we, of course, found out soon enough that they indeed were all died and there were no survivors. The same thing happened in all neighboring towns, as well as in the large city of Krakow. They were shipped to Belzec. We know today from actual the Nazi perpetrators, we know that approximately 600,000 Jews were killed in Belzec. And among them, the Jews from our town, the Jews from the neighboring towns. My father had a brother, Yaslo, who had 6 kids, 4 girls, 2 boys. None of them survived. We were sent back to the ghetto, and there we let my mother, my sister, my little brother out of the hiding, and my cousins let their parents out of the hiding. And we went on as best as we could. It was now much more difficult because the ghetto was sealed, and you had to have a special permit to leave the ghetto. We had such a permit because, again, we were considered important for the economy. Our business had been taken over by an ethnic German. He was now the boss, and we were working for him. So we were leaving the ghetto. We had much less work to do now because a Pole opened a business just like ours, and he took all the business of ours over. But what we did, having the permit to leave, we could scavenge around for food. We would go with a plate of glass under the arms and a couple of tools, as if we were going to work, you know. We would then go to some of the Gentiles that we knew, and we would pick up some food and bring it back into the ghetto. It was tough. A few weeks after that first so-called resettlement action, the Gestapo announced that those who were not permitted to stay and therefore did not receive a blue card, but were in hiding or whatever, if they would voluntarily show up, they will get the permit. So a few people did show up indeed, about 3 or 4. And lo and behold, they got the permit. But about a week later, they made another announcement that those that had not shown up the first time, if they would voluntarily show up, they would be given work and they would be given the permit. That day, I happened to be sent to a refinery in a little shtetl called Jedlice, where there was a big refinery, because now there were few Jews around to do the work. So everybody that was still around in the ghetto had to go and do this work. So I was assigned to work in that refinery. When I came home that evening, my father was there tearing his hair out and crying. And I said, "What's happened? Where's mother? Where's my sister?" My little brother was there. You have to understand that we all lived, a few families, in a single room. So you had no place to go. So when I didn't see my mother and my sister, I knew immediately that something had happened. My father was crying. Apparently they had shown up to receive that permit, but instead were loaded on trucks and taken away. I screamed at my father why he let them out there without me being around, and so on. And my father to me is, "Please don't pour salt on my wounds. You know, I've lost everything." Well, there was nothing to do. I had to go and find out what happened to them. I knew that German SA man who was a dispatcher of trucks for them, because he had lived in the building right next to ours, and he used to come down and he took a liking to me. He was a homosexual, actually. He wanted me to stay with him at night. He asked my mother to go with him because he needed an assistant in case of a Soviet air raid, he claimed. Well, anyway, nothing had happened, but I knew him. So I couldn't go to him that evening because the curfew was there. So I went to him the following morning. His name was Pace, P-A-E-S. So I went to him and I told him, "Mr. Pace, you have to help me. I have to find what happened to my mother and sister." So he told me, "You're too late. If you had told me yesterday, I would have told you that the Gestapo had ordered trucks. But it is too late now." And that was the end of that. So it didn't take very long to find out that they were taken. There were all kinds of rumors the following morning. Some people claimed they went to work here, they took him to work there. Some people claimed they took him to jail, and they are in jail in Jasło. The truth was that they were all taken to a forested area and they were all shot. So now, for the first time, members of my family were gone, my mother and my sister. My younger brother, the one, Shlomo, a year and a half younger than I, had been taken away from the ghetto to clean up the neighboring towns of Jewish possessions, because the Jews were all taken away and killed. So they took about 24 of them to the neighboring town, and they kept there, and they were doing all the sorting of clothing. They went through the Jewish homes and took all the possessions, sorted them out, loaded them, repaired them, and he was there in that town, Jasło. So it was me, my father, my little brother, Heniek, and my younger brother who was in the town of Jasło, and my relative, Moshe Heller, with his wife and the two little babies. Now, Moshe Heller worked with us in our business. The wife of his, her name was Rachel Heller. She was in the same transport as my mother. She also went out, but she described to us what happened. As they were being driven in the direction of Jaslo, they got a flat tire in one of the trucks that they were on. So they stopped to repair the tire. And the Gestapo men from our town, Schmatzler, ordered the Jews to get down and wait until the tire is repaired. And while they were standing there, supposedly my mother approached Schmatzler. She knew him. And she told him, Herr Hauptsturmführer, I am the Glazer Master's wife. So she told us, he hit her in the face, and he told her to stand there in line. She, Rachel, saw a number of peasants from the village going back into town. So while they were talking, she sneaked away, attached herself to the women that were going back into town, the Gentile women, peasant women, and she came back. Wow. And she told us the story. But she didn't know where they were taken to. But she knew they were taken in that direction. I know today that they were taken to a village there, and they were all shot. And I have been there a few times back to Poland and took some film of the area. But there are a bunch of mass graves, and it's difficult to tell which is a mass grave that transport was buried in. There were also many crosses there where Poles were being shot in the same place. And I spoke to a peasant who lived right across the road, who was a youngster then, and now is about 80 years old. And he told me that they were continually bringing people from the surrounding towns and villages, Jews and non-Jews, and they were executing them there. Anyway, so I know more or less where they are buried. Now we were in the ghetto, and we knew that our time was going to be up sooner or later. December 3rd, 1942, the order came out that the following morning the Jews have to assemble in the ghetto on the street there. The ghetto consisted only of about 4 houses that housed the hundreds of Jews. Now the rest were all killed. 80 to 90% had been killed. That we have to assemble there because the city, the ghetto, was going to be completely liquidated. So now we didn't know what to do. So my father, I, and Moshe Heller, and his wife, the 2 babies, and my little brother, we decided that we will go and hide. We sneaked out of the ghetto. We went to our shop where there was a cellar under the floor that you could lift up the cover, and we went down into that cellar. We dressed warm because it was winter. We had to hold the baby's mouth closed so they won't cry or someone will hear us and give us away. And we spent the night, a horrible night there. Of course, no one slept a wink. Very early in the morning, we decided that we have to find out what goes on in the ghetto. So Moshe Heller volunteered to take a plate of glass and going to work and some tools and go out on the street around the ghetto and see what's going on. Well, he came right back, claiming that the ghetto is surrounded by Hivis, those were the volunteer SS of the Ukrainian and the Latvian and Lithuanian volunteers, with machine guns aimed at the ghetto. So what do we do now? We didn't know what to do. So we decided we are going to wait there until the ethnic German who now owned the shop will come into the shop. He usually used to come in around 7:30 in the morning. So we waited. When we heard him opening the shop, we crawled out of that basement. And he, when he saw us, was wondering, what are we doing there? You cannot be here, he told us. What are you doing here? So we told him that the order came out that we have to show up, that the city was going to be free of Jews, and we didn't know, will possibly someone remain? So we came and hid here. Well, he said, you cannot be here. But he said that he will go out into the ghetto and find out what goes on. So he goes out, and within about 5-10 minutes, he's back with Gestapo Becker. And Becker tells us, Becker knew us too, he says, take your stuff and come right with me into the ghetto. So we went back to the ghetto. In the ghetto, all the Jews were already lined up. There were Gestapo from the surrounding towns and the Gestapo from our town. And there were already some dead lying on the street that were shot. The Gestapo man told us, go into your apartment, bring out only one little thing with your necessities, and line up with everybody else. So we went in. I happened to have a goose that a Pole gave me 2 days earlier. And I had the shochet slaughter it, and I thought I was going to make it for the weekend. Well, I took that goose and threw it under the bed, and I thought, let it rot there. We went out and lined up. Okay, so now there was more shooting going on. Whoever came into that ghetto late was put against the wall and shot. And I remember so vividly, the Tepe family came in late. They were shot. A kid that I knew very well from a village of Turashuvka, who worked for a sweet baker for Mr. Koenig in our town, he came in his white jacket. He apparently stayed overnight in that bakery. Beckett put him on the side and shot him. Others were shot there. Then someone brought in a lady on a sled, and she was throwing herself back and forth, crying, and the head of the Gestapo of Jaslo took the carabin from one of the Ukrainian SS and shot her point blank into the head. Anyway, what happened now is Schmatzler, the head of the Gestapo in Krosto, came by, and he took me out, my father, Moshe Heller, and a cousin of mine who was a mechanic and tool and die maker, and told us that we are going to be sent to the air base, to the barracks there, to work, and that nobody was going to remain in the ghetto. We pleaded with him to let my little brother go with us. And he said, no, he cannot go, he's too young. But he says to my father, he says, I promise you that he is not going to go zum lieben Gott. He is not going to go to the Almighty. That they are going to go to a ghetto in Reichshof, which is called in Polish Rzeszów, which was a larger ghetto. and that's where they are going to be at. My cousin, the mechanic, had a little boy, Michael, who was about 5 years old. And they wouldn't let the little boy go with him either. So he suggested to my father that he will take his boy, Michael, as well as my brother, with him to Rzeszów, to the ghetto there. And since we are going to stay in our town, where we could probably forage for food and other things, we might be able to help them in that ghetto in Rzeszów. And I cannot describe to you, because it's extremely difficult to describe, the feeling when they were marched out of the ghetto, crying, turning their heads to us as if praying, for help, but you couldn't help them. They were marched out of the ghetto. A number of other Jews were selected out, and they were sent to the wood mill in our town there, and so on. Anyway, about 120 of us were selected to go to the air base. Amongst them was the carpenter, the sheet metal worker. These are all people considered essential for the economy. Within a couple of minutes that all these people were marched out of the ghetto, one of the Gestapo men, whose name was Hauch, brings back Rachel, that was Moshe's wife, the one that escaped from the transport, with the 2 babies on her arms, put them in the corner, pulls out his revolver, shoots her and the 2 babies on her arms. Now the babies were about 2 years old, somewhere around there. And he shot her there, right in front of our eyes. And they were taken out, and they indeed were taken to the ghetto in Reichshof. While we were assembled there in the ghetto, a group of Gestapo went to the air base, to the barracks that Jews were housed and worked there, took out the women and the children, and the ones that they considered not needed there, and left only about 100 Jews there. There were over 300 there. And they attached them to the same transport from the ghetto to go to the ghetto in Rzeszów.
Keep going.
A wet snow started falling, and we were standing there, approximately 24 of us, to go to the air base. Soon, a sanitary wagon, horse-drawn wagon, came into the ghetto with some Poles from the sanitary crew, threw all the dead people on the wagon and drove them off, apparently to the Jewish cemetery for burial. After a while, 2 airmen came from the air base and marched us off to the air base, to the barracks there, where there were already some of the Jews working there, but there were only about 100 left. So with us, 24, there was a total of 124 of us assigned to work at the base in the barracks. And in order to make a long story short, because time is running out, I have to leave here. We were at the air base for the entire year of 1943. We lived in the barracks there. We were assigned to work. My father worked in the cellar of the enlisted men's kitchen, peeling potatoes, sorting potatoes, unloading food, and so on and so on. There were others working with him. One man by the name of Shia Wolf Safaran, who used to be a neighbor of ours, a very, very orthodox, ultra-orthodox religious man. Of course, he didn't have any more payas then, he had to shave it all. Mr. Taubenfeld and a few others were working there. The sergeant in charge of the kitchen would give him here and there some food to take to the barracks. At the airbase, I got very sick about a month later, developed a high fever, was confused, and there was a Jewish doctor amongst us, the prisoners, who didn't know what I had. I was confused and extremely weak with high fever. My father brought from the kitchen some food that the sergeant, the German sergeant in charge of the enlisted men's kitchen, would give him to give to me. He was a nice man, and he treated them very nicely. I recovered slowly after a few weeks. I was put to work in the military laundry with some Polish women there and so on. And this gentleman, the Polish man, Mr. Socha, who used to haul glass for us, happened to haul sand to the airbase. So he would bring us some bread, some other provisions that we would pay him for it. He would also bring us a note here and there from my brother, who was in Yaswo, if he managed to smuggle out a note of there, and from my father's brother, Sam, who worked in a munition factory in Skarżysko there, and would also try to send out through a Pole working there a note to him, and he would bring it to us. So we knew where my father's brother was, the one that survived, and we knew where my brother was. But around February of 1943, all of a sudden, we received no more messages from them. I feared that something happened to my brother. And again, without going into detail, because we have no time, I found out after the war that he was shot in 1943 in Yaswo. This was related to me to a girl from a village near my hometown who worked with him in Yaswo, sorting out the clothes and shipping it all to Germany and so on. But she didn't want to tell me. She was with me at Schindler's Camp later on in Sudetenland, but never would tell me what happened to him until long after the war, when I insisted that she tell me. Apparently, he tried to send a communication to us, and either someone reported him or someone saw him, and they took him into the ghetto and shot him in front of all the other people there, the 2,000 that were there, with the warning to the others, that's what's going to happen to you if you should try to communicate with the outside. So now my brother was gone. So I was alive, and this relative of mine, the brother of my aunt, the husband of that Rachel with the two babies. and we were at the air base. We were there again for the entire year of 43, and we were treated reasonably well there. Of course, the food we received was sent to us, or we used to pick it up from a concentration camp in Shebnia, where there were many Jews after about 5,000 Soviet prisoners of war who were in that camp were all executed. So it became a concentration camp for Jews and Poles. And one of my cousins, Black Joe, we called him because he was dark-haired. I had 3 cousins. One was a redhead, one was a blonde, and one was dark. So we called them the Red Joe and the Black Joe and the White Joe. So, so Black Joe was there, and 2 of my other first cousins, 2 girls, sisters of Red Joe, were there in that concentration camp. So we were the only ones alive. And we picked up our provisions at that concentration camp in Shebnia. Barley most of the time. There was no meat or whatever. And it was cooked in a kitchen in our barracks. But to tell you frankly, we threw much of it away. And almost every day somebody else had to take the kettle of it and throw it into the latrine little by little so that no one will know when we're throwing that away. Because we were able to get food through the Poles that were working at the air base, so we didn't eat this stuff. And some people would use the barley, concentrate it, and make something out of it. The rest we used to discard, I hate to say. I'm saying this because there is a book that is written by a Polish historian, and I read that booklet, and she relates there that one of the girls that worked at the air base and told them that we suffered horrible hunger and mistreatment and maltreatment and all that. Absolutely untrue. We were better off than in the ghetto. We were even better off than before the ghetto at the air base. I never heard a curse or a name calling by any of the soldiers or the officers there. And as a matter of fact, a girl who survived with me at Schindler's and was with me at that air base, Sonia Garayover is her name. She lives now in Australia. She's still alive. I saw her there a number of years ago when I visited there. She used to work in the officers' club with another Polish girl. And one day, one of the airmen complained to the lieutenant in charge of the officers' club that those 2 girls were stealing food for themselves. He called them in and bawled them out and threatened them that he will report them to the Gestapo if they continue doing this. All of this in front of that accuser. The following morning, he called these 2 girls in, and he said, "Look, girls, take whatever you want. I had to do this because he stood there, and I had to do that." Just to give you an example of that there were some good people. Also, there was a captain. His name was Herzl. He hailed from Frankfurt, who used to come into the barracks, our barracks. And since my father and I and my relative were in the first room of the barracks, he used to come in and sit down and talk to my father. He wanted to know how we were treated and this and that. And I remember he would come in one day after Hamburg had been firebombed by the Allies, and over 100,000 Germans were killed. He came in the barracks, he sat down, and he told us that. And he said, "Do you know why this happens to us? Because what we are doing to you people." You see? So here you have another human being, with a heart. This is something very surprising if I tell anybody that there were Germans like this. And there were. In my book, which I published just recently, there's my conclusion about my viewpoint of humanity in general, of all peoples, makes no difference, of all nationalities, of all institutions, of all peoples, that there were the good, there were the bad, but both together amounted only to a small percentage. The vast majority were the indifferent. And that holds true for all nations as well, including the USA. Didn't the USA send back the St. Louis, the ship, with 800 Jewish people, including children, wouldn't even let the children off the boat and send them back to be killed in Europe? Didn't Sweden and Switzerland do business with Hitler, supply them, Sweden especially, with steel, which he needed for war material? And the Swiss did all kinds of business, took his gold from the Jewish victims and so on, and traded with them. Didn't the church know about all this? And the church as an institution did absolutely nothing. Individual priests, individual nuns did, but as an institution, they did absolutely nothing. And after the war, they even assisted some of the Nazis to escape to Argentina. So that goes for all nationalities. There were good Poles, thousands of them, that were hiding Jews. There were awful Poles, called Schmalzowniks, who extorted monies from the Jews that managed to skip the ghetto and be on false Aryan papers, and so on. So there were the good, there were the bad. Unfortunately, the bad outnumbered the good. But both together didn't amount to more than at the most 10%. 90% were the indifferent ones. They didn't see, they didn't hear, nor, not that it wasn't there to see and hear. It was there if you looked out the window. They just didn't care to see or to hear. And it goes for Jews as well. There were Jewish policemen. You have seen it in some of the films from the ghettos, how they were hitting the people, assisting the Germans, shipping their people to the gas chambers, to Treblinka and to Belzec and so on. So that goes for humanity in general. Now I deviated from what I was talking about just to point something out that I think people should know. Now, so we were there for the entire year of 1943 at that air base. At the end of 1943, the air base got the order to move all of them to the Eastern Front. They were suffering now on the Eastern Front. It was past Stalingrad. And they were now retreating. So they needed all the young people that were at the airbase, or all youngsters at the airbase, they needed all of them on the Eastern Front. So the command changed, and a new command from the Eastern Front was going to come and take over. They brought with them about 400 Uzbeki prisoners of war to work. Now, the SS chief of the concentration camp in Kraków-Płaszów, not anymore Szebnie. Szebnie was liquidated, they were all shot there or sent to Auschwitz. My two cousins, the two girls' cousins, the sisters of Red Joe, were shot there. Black Joe was sent to Auschwitz from there. So there was no one left in Szebnie anymore. So we were now under the jurisdiction of the Kraków-Płaszów concentration camp. So we were ordered, shipped via Szebnie. We went to Szebnie first to clean up after all the people that they killed or shipped off there, and we were sent to Kraków-Płaszów. We got to Kraków-Płaszów in cattle trains, of course. It was winter, it was January of 1944. And we were lined up. There we saw for the first time Mr. Hilovich, who was the head Jewish capo of the camp, Mr. Farber, who was his deputy there, and a number of other capos that ruled that camp. They lined us up in a circle and gave us an introduction. Farber gave the introduction, he says. The good time at the airbase is over. Here, it's a different ball of wax. And he was going to assign us to work in different places. I approached him respectfully, because my father had problems with frozen fingertips. So I approached him, and whether he could be kind enough to assign my father to work indoors with the shoemakers. The shoemaker chief was a man from our hometown, and my father knew him. As I approached him, he gave me a hit in the face. How I dare address him. He shipped me right back in line. Anyway, he gave us a little lecture. He assigned us to clean the mud there for that day, and later we were going to go for delousing to the bath. As we came into that bathhouse, as we were undressing, I saw a young woman lying dead on a bench there. So I asked one of the prisoners, the Jewish prisoners, working in that bathhouse, what is this woman doing here? He said, you guys are lucky that you came here that late in January. I said, what do you mean lucky? I'm not lucky at all being here. He said, this has been declared a concentration camp by Berlin, the middle of January. Now anyone that gets shot, a report has to go to Berlin. A report has to be written out as to why that individual was shot and so on. Apparently, what we heard was that Goethe, who was the commandant of that camp in Kraków-Płaszów, was shooting people like in a duck hunt. He would walk around from place to place and just shoot at will. Now, if anyone gets shot, it has to be reported. So this woman is lying there until a report is sent out to Berlin. They are not allowed to bury her until then. Okay. Well, we went through the showers. And in order to finish this, because I have to leave, I will tell you that I lost my father and Moshe Heller, the husband of Rachel with the two babies that was shot in the ghetto. I lost them in mid-May of 1944, there in Krakow, Płaszów, during this election, which used to be called the Naked Parade, they called it. You had to undress naked, walk by a doctor who would point this one to the right, this one to the left, and so on. And my father and Moshe Heller were pointed into the wrong side. I was pointed into the right side. And about a week later, they took him away to Auschwitz, and that's where they were killed. So now I was the only survivor of the entire family. I'm going to stop here, and I will go later. Okay. I'm going to start again with Krakow, Płaszów. I think I left off as we were shipped from the airbase in my hometown of Krosno via a concentration camp called Szebnie, which is only miles away from Krosno, where there were previously Soviet prisoners of war, about 5,000 of them, which they executed in a ravine nearby, and then made it into a Jewish and a Polish concentration camp. About a month before we arrived, which was January 1944, to that camp in Szebnie, the people there were shipped off to Auschwitz. A group of about 1,000 was left, and my cousin, who was one of those that were shipped to Auschwitz and who survived the war in Buchenwald, told me that they had to take their clothes off, leaving only their jacket on the train in order not to escape. The 1,000 that were left, amongst whom were two of my first cousins, Baila and Doba Platner, was taken later into a forested area and executed. And this was the end of the camp in Szebnie. Now, when we arrived, there was nobody there, and as a result of it, we were assigned to clean up the camp after the previous inmates. It was a completely different situation there than at the airbase. Whereas at the airbase we had decent barracks and we were treated relatively decently, here the barracks were stables. And it was absolutely awful. The bunks were 3 stories up. It was very cold, but fortunately we were only there for about a week while we cleaned up from the previous inmates, and we were then loaded again on a cattle train and shipped to Krakow, Płaszów. When we arrived at the train station of Płaszów, which is a suburb of Krakow, they were waiting for us there, and they marched us into the camp. When we arrived into the camp, we were lined up in a circle, and the chief capo, which means leader of the camp, Mr. Hilovich, and his deputy, Maniek Farber, were there. They gave us a little inaugural speech, telling us that the holidays at the airbase are over with, and here we will have to adapt to completely different conditions. When I approached Ferber, asking him to possibly send my father to the shoemaker section, where the head was a man from my hometown who had moved to Krakow and had a shoemaker shop in Krakow originally, because my father had a problem with his fingertips, which were frozen and they were numb. And as I approached him, asking him to assign my father there, the introduction to me was a hit in the face for daring to approach him. That gave me a taste of what it's going to be like.